we good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. This is the Birmingham Public Schools Board of Education, a special meeting titled the Superintendent Candidate Semifinalist Interview Meeting. And today is Tuesday, December 11th, 2018. My name is Kim Whitman, and I have the privilege to serve our community as the Board of Education President for the 2018-2019 school year. And tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming back Dr. Christopher Delgado. We welcome each of you here tonight, and for those not watching at home yet, because we are being videotaped, we're meeting at the EAC at 13 Mile and Evergreen. So please note that, again, this meeting is being taped. However, it's not being shown live for interest of keeping the questions confidential for the next candidate. So this version will be viewable tomorrow at 12 o'clock noon. So please pass that along to the community. Tomorrow evening's meeting, as well as Thursday's 5 o'clock meeting, will be streamed live. And that's either by searching us on YouTube or going under our district tab and pulling at the BOE tab. So with that, the first order of business is roll call. So Fran, would you please take roll?
Trustee Angeloni? Present. Trustee Jennings?
Here.
Trustee Rothschild?
Here.
Trustee Dyke?
Here.
Trustee Thomas? Trustee Whitman?
Here.
Trustee Young?
Here. Thank you, Fran. First order of business, any board comments?
I had a great day. I was able to take our esteemed candidate here to a couple of schools, and we had a wonderful time visiting Seaholm, and I want to thank Kyle Hall and Seaholm for welcoming us. Then we went over to Berkshire and loved going back to my old stomping grounds. It was so much fun. I want to thank Jason Klinkscale for his welcome, and then we ended up at Greenfield and had the best time ever in those little kindergarten and first grade classrooms. So we thank Noelle Davis for her welcome.
I would second that, too. It was a nice day.
It was a really nice day.
Really nice day.
So just quickly to recap for the community, and before we turn it over to Dr. Delgado to present his 100-day plan, this morning we conducted 3 interview forums here at the EAC. The Birmingham Education Administration was group 1, the Central Administration Leadership Principals was group 2, and then we had a community member / parent group, which was number 3. Then, as Lori mentioned, that there are several trustee and trustee-elects took Dr. Delgado out to lunch, and then they transitioned and did 3 school visits. Again, Seaholm High School, Berkshire Middle School, and then Greenfield Elementary. We then brought Dr. Delgado back to the EAC, where we just had a community meet and greet. So hopefully, for those of you that participated, you had an opportunity to meet Chris and his wife, Leslie. So as we wrap up today's first day, we'll first turn it over to Dr. Delgado for his 100-day plan, and then the trustees will have an opportunity to ask questions, kind of a Q&A session. So with that, Chris, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, for the opportunity to come back. It's nice to be back. So what I have before the community, before the public, is a synopsis of a 100-day entry plan, transition plan, that I gave all of the board members and then the trustee-elects a copy of, that has more description than what I'm going to be able to share tonight, but I'm going to kind of give you the highlights of how I came up with this 100-day transition plan. So I believe in data, I believe in research, and I think that metrics are important when you're looking at any kind of goal-setting process. So the Superintendent Preparation Academy is an academy that I completed through the Michigan Leadership Institute that has some standards and evaluative metrics for superintendents. Additionally, in the superintendent evaluation instrument that you're very familiar with in terms of evaluating superintendents here in the state of Michigan, that evaluation is based on 2 professional standards. You can see that one is from the National Board Policy, or Policy Board for Educational Administration, and the second is through McCrell. So based on those standards, I've developed my philosophy, my mission around 5 themes. The governance team. Based on the research, it talks about the most important thing is the governance team and the relationship that a board has with its superintendent. one of my first goals needs to be to establish that working relationship with all of you, with individual board members as well as the board as a whole. In addition to governance, another pillar is organizational capacity and alignment. And the research recommends building this strong, appropriately focused district executive team. For me, that would immediately be working with my cabinet, as well as all of our principals, assistant principals, directors in the district. You can see the illustration here that highlights what I mentioned in the first interview, is my emphasis on mission, vision, values, and goals. I think when you think systemically and you work with your leadership team as an organization, that's a real important role of a superintendent, is to help maintain that focus, that vision, and look at those metrics. So that organizational capacity is not only cultivated, but it's aligned. The third thing is student achievement. And really that's what we're about. It's about the kids, it's about the students. As a new superintendent, I'll have to understand these current strategies, what strengths exist, what opportunities for improvement in the instructional program exist. And that has to do with meeting with our cabinet, talking with our teachers, talking with our parents, talking with the students to see what their experiences are. It also involves reviewing curriculum and looking at whether or not we're delivering that curriculum with fidelity and if there are any opportunities for changes. The fourth pillar in any kind of successful superintendency is community and public relations. And you're meeting community members, and you'll see in the 90-day plan as I walk through the groups that I specifically intend to meet with. But you meet with community members, political and parent leaders, in part to develop those relationships, to start those conversations, to generate goodwill, and to establish those open lines of communication. The strongest, healthiest communities are those that have partnerships with their community members, that we rely on each other. And there's a lot that you can do when you have extensive community partnerships. And finally, operations and finance. And yes, this is an attempt at humor that we're going to be surgical with our piggy bank here. But understanding our current strategies, the strengths, and the opportunities in operational and finance areas. We've talked a lot about budget deficits over the years. I explained to you my role as one of 7 people on the cabinet in Walled Lake of cutting over $70 million in the last 15 years. Those are hard decisions for boards of education and to make and for administration to recommend. And it's important that we analyze that we're getting return on our investment, as well as distinguishing between expenditures or investments when we talk about programming, because there is a difference, and sometimes you spend money on the things that you value, and they're not just an expense. So those pillars really discuss kind of how I frame my leadership and how research frames the superintendency. In your binder, I think on page 3, you'll see this yellow sheet, this spreadsheet. I'll show the audience. This is who I am. This is the way that I approach all my tasks, very, very methodically, very strategic. You can see that I've listed the goals in the 100-day plan, the critical components that align back to those standards. So any of the teachers in the room, any of the former teachers, we understand that you have the standards, that you have your substandards, and you align them. So these show you the critical components that speak back to those 5 pillars. And you can also see the date completed. So when I think of progress monitoring, the first thing is prioritization. In my first 100 days, I'll have to make some really important decisions very quickly. One of the challenges of coming in mid-year is, what do you need to attend to first? There are a lot of competing interests. There are time-sensitive deadlines. So prioritization is a big piece, and that's why a spreadsheet helps. I do believe in goal setting. I've said this before. If you've ever seen the acronym SMART, which I'm sure you have, that matters. A specific goal. These are measurable goals in the first 100 days. I believe these are achievable things, all the things that I'm going to tell you that I'm going to do, that they're absolutely relevant to this school district and to a superintendent's leadership, and that they're time-bound, specifically within those first 100 days. We talked last time at the interview about a high-achieving district like Birmingham and how you take a district from good to great. I believe that all of these processes, tracking your progress, goal setting, working with your leadership team to have similar goal setting sessions, that allows you to have continual improvement. And this spreadsheet and the monitoring, you can see that I've already begun. So some of the things that I've already accomplished include researching every school district program Even though I am kind of a quasi-internal candidate, I know a lot about the schools and I know a lot of people in the school district, I don't know everything about the district. So I've intentionally researched every school program and school in the district. I have reviewed the strategic plan, your mission, vision, values, goals we talked about before, the diversity initiatives in those plans, researched the achievement scores, and then also read all the collective bargaining agreements. I think that's really important for a person to step in, especially mid-year, and especially if you have time-sensitive aspects. So in the first 10 days, I broke my 100-day plan into the first 10 days. The first 10 days really are about 3 groups of people: you, the Board of Education, the Cabinet, and then students and teachers. So the first thing with the Board of Education, I need to work with Ms. Whitman, with our board president, and plan a Superintendent Board of Education session. It's really important for me to know your expectations of me, to establish that working relationship, clarify what your goals are for me, for the district, the expectations you have, and the metrics for the remainder of this school year. Oftentimes, the National School Boards Association, MASB, other organizations use the key work of school boards. You're probably familiar with that. Board 101, governance. I think it's a really important first step for us to do, and especially with 3 new trustees coming on board, that will be a really healthy way for us to begin that working relationship. The second thing is with Cabinet. I've already had the pleasure of meeting the Cabinet members, and I'm really excited about the possibility of working with them. But I need to immediately meet with them individually to begin to develop those relationships, to understand their roles, to hear their concerns, to hear their goals, and essentially to start to develop that team. I'm sure they already have a good working relationship, but how I fit into that is really critical. So in those first 10 days, I have to have those individual meetings and get an update from them. And then students and teachers. In the same way that I create this matrix of things I say I'm going to do, and I will, I look forward to handing you a completed one. I want to create a matrix of every student organization, club, activity, co-curricular in this district to track my participation at those events. I think that superintendents need to be visible. They need to support all programs, all students, everywhere. And I think it's feasible if you plan it. And if you know the activities that kids and parents and teachers are pouring their hearts into, you should be there as the superintendent. And so immediately in the first 10 days, I would hope to begin attending student and community events. And my last piece in the first 10 days, for dramatic effect, I'm going to visit every classroom and program in the district in the first 10 days. Oof. And I can do this because it's what I do right now in Walled Lake. I have 19 schools that I oversee. I have it down to a science. I can get through an elementary school in about an hour and 10 minutes, get into every single classroom. I don't need a grand introduction. I'm just interested in what the teachers are doing, seeing the interaction, talking with students. Secondary schools take a little bit longer, but in the first 10 days, if you plan it, it happens. And I think it will be really important for people to see me and for me to see them at every single school in this district. And if that means you do a couple schools a day, that's fine. And then you get to, we talked about this before, about prioritizing your day. You get to email, you get to phone calls later. It's about the students and the kids. So in the first 10 days, that's what I intend to do. Month 1, you can see I left as a standing kind of agenda item here, continuing to visit schools and programs and attend student and community events. I think that's a given. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the things. There's a more extensive list in the first month. So I'd like to meet in that first month with every administrator or administrative team in the same way that I met with Cabinet for the same reasons, to meet with them and understand the unique aspects of their schools. I've researched their schools, but I'd like to visit their schools. I'd like to talk with them and understand what they're working on with their staff. I'd like to meet with all of the union presidents. I think it's really important for a continual conversation to happen with your collective bargaining groups and to do that on a consistent basis. And I think similar to the importance that I'm placing on administrators, I think that relationship with our union leadership matters as well and would intend to continue that. I want to meet with the Seaholm and Grove student leadership teams. We talked about today at the building visits. I've been a deputy superintendent now. This is my 8th year in central office, and even though I try to get to the buildings as often as I can, it's very different working in central office as opposed to a school. And you need kind of your kid fix to kind of keep you connected with the kids. But the See Home and Grove student leadership teams, I'd like to meet with them, hear what their goals are for their schools in the same way that I've talked to the other individuals. And I know that one of the things that I'd like to do is hear, what would they like to see, especially the seniors who are leaving, who, if you've ever talked to a group of seniors, especially in the second semester, there's no filter. They tell you what they're thinking. So you can really get a good sense of a school by talking to students. And so I put them right up there with the other individuals. I'd like to, in the first month, hold 2 parent kind of coffee talks or tea talks. I'm thinking maybe an AM one or a PM one to try to make myself accessible to the community, maybe at the Baldwin Library or another community location. But just another opportunity similar to tonight. I enjoyed our conversation tonight with as many community members who could show up, and I think to make myself available. That would be something that I would consistently offer coffees or visitations throughout the school year. The strategic plan, as you know, expires in 2018, and so I would immediately need to make sure that I review with individuals, discuss what our planning is. Have we already begun that? Are we waiting for the new trustees or waiting for the superintendent? But the strategic planning preparations needs to happen immediately. And I know that we talked a little bit last time about how we have measurable goals and looking at what our vision is for the district. So that work needs to get going. Oops, sorry, let me go back. And then I want to develop a schedule and a timeline of building and program visitations for the remainder of this year. One of the things that we do in Walled Lake is our entire cabinet does building visits. I may have mentioned that before. It helps when your business person, your facilities person, your human resources person get to the schools and interact with the kids, and it just reminds us all of why we do the good work that we do. And I'd like to continue that pattern here, so I develop a schedule in that first month. Month 2. I'd like to meet with the community groups, the foundation, Birmingham Youth Assistance. We haven't had an opportunity to speak very much in the last interview or this so far about my involvement with the Community Coalition. I was very heavily involved in the Birmingham Bloomfield Community Coalition. It's a huge source of pride, and we helped start a Lakes Area Community Coalition in Walled Lake. So I think that prevention effort, those are incredibly important. I know the individuals, Carol Mastriani, who runs the executive director there, and so I'd like to meet with the BBCC and pick up kind of where we left off with the Youth Action Board and some of those aspects. Love to meet with the Friends of Different Learners. I had the opportunity to meet with a handful of folks who were on both the community interview and then at the meet and greet. So I'd like to meet with them and look at their mission, and then other groups as well. In the plan, you can see I want to meet with the individuals from Next and some of the other community-based organizations. Now, this may be a little risky, but I think it's important to meet with the local media to establish those connections, those relationships for the promotion of the district. So many times I see school districts that are just reactionary. If something happens, then you're on the news, and then you react. If you have a relationship with people, and you understand that they may give you the benefit of the doubt, they may give you a call. If they are hearing something, you might be able to give them kind of the true story or help, not control that story, but help guide the way they deliver that story. So I think all these relationships are important. I think it makes a difference when a superintendent is in contact with those folks. I actually was going to do this in month 2, but we just took care of it tonight, so we can scratch this one off my list. So I discussed with Mr. Neforos any contract negotiations. I had originally thought some expired in 2018, but because of his good work and staggering, we're in good shape. So we don't have to discuss contract negotiations yet. We could discuss strategy, but we don't have to discuss those yet. We do have to discuss the annual budget process. We know that the annual revenue conference happens in January, February, and then with a new governor, and we don't know what her proposal is going to be. So that process has to begin obviously early, and so we'd be meeting to talk about what our process is. I've mentioned a few times before that we go on what I call a budget roadshow, where we actually, once we have a budget that our board is comfortable with and we have a recommended talking points, that we go to some of the schools and PTAs. I don't know if that happens here, if that's something we might be interested in, but I'd like to talk about the budget process and how we get to that final budget. And then really dig in month 2. Obviously, I've already begun this process, but looking at that academic performance data and trying to analyze that correlation between the priorities of the district, both of the strategic plan and the school improvement plans. I work directly with all of our principals on school improvement plans, and I can't tell you how many school improvement plans, and I was guilty of this as a principal too, how many are written by a principal or a principal and assistant principal in the summer, as opposed to being a collaborative exercise that is supposed to involve stakeholders, involve teachers, involve parents. And it's not by any fault of people. We get busy and everyone leaves and the principal has to get it in by the deadline. So we've tried to really work at it, make a concerted effort of making school improvement plans being the living, breathing document in our district. And so I'd like to make sure that our academic performance, our goals are aligning with all of those plans. Month 3, you see, I continue to visit these programs. I'd like to meet with the local law enforcement officials. In the booklet, I shared a few pictures in there, and one of those pictures is an organization. In Walled Lake, we have 9 municipalities, and so we have law enforcement from Oakland County Sheriff as well as several other ones. I have periodic meetings with all of our law enforcement where we bring them together to talk about safety and security in our district. And we talk about the best practices. I know you've entered into the ALICE training. That's something that we're dipping our toe in as well. And so I'd like to meet with those law enforcement officials, make those connections, talk about ALICE, talk about best practices, and maintain that contact. Obviously, it's important for you to have people at the ready, but people that are willing to train your staff as well. Same goes for city and government officials. In Birmingham, in the area, you don't have as many municipalities, but you have pockets of different places that it's important for me to meet those folks to understand how they partner with the school district, questions they may have. And again, part of this is establishing those connections. And they may already exist, and so I'd be aided by that if people already have those connections and can maybe make those introductions. I mentioned last time, I spent a full day last week in Lansing with superintendents from around the state, meeting with local legislators around Oakland County specifically, and lobbying against some of the proposed cuts or proposed changes they wanted to do in lame duck session. And we didn't take a position, yes or no, on the positions. We weren't trying to influence their vote in that way. What we were simply asking is, don't make these monumental decisions in 12 session days. That wait until there's more time to debate and discuss things like letter grading and tax policy and oversight. Kind of committee that sits aside of the Board of Education. So it was a fascinating process, but it just drove home the importance of superintendents having connections and relationships with their local legislators and helping them to understand how their policy decisions will impact families in our respective districts. And so I was up there with superintendents all over the state doing that. And then the Oakland County Superintendents Association, the superintendents group, this is month 3, so after my first 10 days, that would be coming up on 100 days, I'd like to meet with that group. Obviously, if I'm fortunate enough to get the job, I'll be meeting with them monthly. But I have wonderful mentors throughout this county, throughout this state. Ken Gutman, my superintendent in Walled Lake, has been a veteran superintendent for over a decade. Another one of my references, Dr. Rob Glass in Bloomfield Hills, has been over a decade, very successful superintendent. George Heitch from Farmington. I know these individuals. I partnered with them for years and years, and so they're trusted mentors, and so obviously I have a really supportive group of individuals that I could bounce ideas off as I step into this role, going from the deputy to the superintendent. And then the next thing, because I'm always a forward thinker, first of all, I would print out this yellow sheet and I would turn it into you and say, see, I got it done. And I'd create a new plan for the remainder of the school year, and if you'd so like, submit it to the board. Again, I believe in goal setting, I believe in metrics, I believe it's really important for us to do that. In the 90-day plan, and I'll wrap up here, the role of a superintendent, I have kind of a tagline there as a header, and these are 3 components that I really believe in, and partnership is the first one, and it's intentionally first, because nothing happens without relationships. And superintendents need to partner with everyone in the organization, specifically with parents, with community members, and with your employees. And you need, in order to do that, you have to be out amongst them. You have to get to events, you have to go to schools, and that's the superintendent I intend to be. Preparation. You can see that I'm very methodical, perhaps type A. That's the way I prepare, ensuring that we're thinking systemically, that we're looking at every aspect, that we're trying to understand how we prepare to do the real goal, which is learning. Superintendents help maintain focus on teaching and learning in supportive environments. And if you just put that on a bumper sticker, that's what it's all about. Maintaining focus in supportive environments on teaching and learning. And I really think that's the role of the superintendent. And when I think about my first 100 days and the days beyond, that's how I believe I would approach my superintendency. And that's my 100-day plan.
Great, thank you. Okay, trustees, I will open up the floor for questions.
Okay. Well, is it okay if I begin?
Sure.
Because I have one just actually off of the last thing you said about the role of a superintendent, and you mentioned partnerships, preparation, and learning. And then you said, maintain a focus on teaching and learning in supportive environments. And I wonder what things, what measures could you put in place, or what relationships will you cultivate in order to retain our teaching staff? We've had such a loss of students going into this profession. And so our pools at the job fairs are shrinking incredibly, are shrinking so much. And then oftentimes we will get teachers, young teachers, and they will teach a couple of years and they either move on to a different district or they change professions. So what do you think, what would you do in order to shift that thinking and culture?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I too worry a little bit about our profession. This came up in the first interview session this morning in the group with the teachers about who is going into our profession with the level of scrutiny that has occurred with the high stakes evaluation and accountability. And so I worry a little bit about that. I see the same in my college classes that I teach of students who don't want to go into administration either. So I think part of what you do is you start with kind of a really robust new teacher orientation, whether they're new to your district or they're brand new teachers. Another picture there in my 90 days plan is me presenting to the new teacher group, the orientation. So all of our cabinet members do that, but we also follow up with a really robust mentorship program, not only with veteran teachers, but meeting back with central office members. So just a couple of days ago, we actually had our superintendent and our assistant superintendent of HR who ran a session on new teacher feedback, so midway through the year. And so it not only part of that, and they're actually going through Bowman and Deal's four frames, if you're familiar with that, but they're looking at how you kind of approach the profession and how you retain people. And part of that is intentionally at this time of the year in December, telling these brand new teachers, stick to it, stick with it, it'll be okay, acknowledging their hard work and kind of encouraging them to grow and know that they have the support and the admiration of central office. So the other thing, in addition to a mentorship program, is talking about helping them take chances and be innovative in their classrooms. And again, we spoke a little bit about this in the last interview, about how with the evaluation the way it is, we need to really give people permission and mean it, that they can have stretch goals, that they can try to innovate and have really, really interesting programs. I've talked to so many people today, I can't remember who I told this story to, but one of the things I did this past year is I presented to a group of principals. We have a leadership team retreat right in August. And I presented to principals, and one of the things I challenged them with was to look at innovative schools around the country and innovative programs, and to come up with something, a contact, that they might be able to pilot in their schools. And so I challenged them with that, and then the promise to them was that if they could find an innovative school, we would send them to that school. So we had one assistant principal who followed up with a school in Amsterdam that is doing phenomenal things with standards, really standards-based instruction, where they've eliminated K-12 grade levels. And so students move at their own pace. And so she has worked with some of her teachers at this high school to look at how we move kids through kind of a progression of 2 or 3 or 4 year curriculum as a pilot without having to assign grade levels. And so as a reward, we're sending her to Amsterdam. She's going to meet with this group of teachers and bring that back. And so that's one example of, that was me as a cabinet official challenging people and giving them the permission to be innovative. When principals are allowed to do that, work with their teachers, people want to stay in this profession. They want to commit because they see they're part of a progressive district, a forward-thinking district. And if they're acknowledged periodically for that hard work, then that really, really helps them stay in the profession.
What about at the legislative level? There's been so much legislation that has been passed in I don't know, the past, I'm going to say 7, 8 years, where I think teachers become a scapegoat, and it's been so negative. And so, now we have that whole piece.
Right. So one of the things, actually, I was with legislators just the other day. There are two things that I say to them. The first thing is I tell them, what about your kids? Think about the experience of your child in their school. And if you pass these policies that make it less and less attractive for quality people to go into our profession, how is that going to affect your child? And I give them some concrete examples. And the second thing is I remind them, once upon a time, there used to be a social compact, if you will, for people who went into public fields, that we knew there was a ceiling on your salary, and we knew that, that you weren't going to have as much flexibility to negotiate contracts and salaries, but you did that in exchange for quality benefits and for a good middle-class life. And somehow along the years, that's changed. And the scrutiny on public education and public educators has changed. And I try to remind legislators of that these dedicated people are teaching your children, they're teaching the future of this country, and they deserve more respect. And so I try to influence them as much as I can.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Delgado, I was wondering, could you could you express a little bit of your opinion on the honors program? Just how you feel about honors. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So again, I may repeat a story, but I'll start with a story and then I'll kind of give you my thoughts on honors. My first administrative position, I was an assistant principal at Andover High School in Bloomfield Hills, and I was in charge of the master schedule. And I had a student about 2 weeks before the end of the semester come to me and ask if he could drop out of honors. He was in honors, Spanish 400 honors. If he could drop out of honors to get to the regular class. And I said, well, why would you want to do that? And there's only 2 weeks before the semester. And he explained to me that the honors designation, the grading scale was 93% to 100 was an A. But if you were 90% to an A, that was the regular class, and it was not honors. So I worked it out with him. He stuck it out, and he stayed with the honors, and I think he actually got a B in the honors, which was fine. But that opened my eyes to the misnomer of honors. So that led to a deep conversation with our department heads and with our principal at the time about what honors is supposed to be. Honors is not supposed to be about more or faster. It's supposed to be about depth and application of knowledge to a problem or to a challenge. I believe I may have shared last time, my son, our oldest son Antonio, is in the Honors College at Michigan State. And in order for them to graduate with honors in 4 years, they have to do 8 extended assignments, deep research-based assignments that actually are collaboratively done with other classmates that really take the knowledge they've learned in a class and enhance it. And so we can replicate some of that in high schools in terms of an honors level. But honors can't simply be a grade point differential, and it can't be just more or faster. And so the other thing is, I oversee the guidance counseling program in Walled Lake, and I talk to our high school counselors all the time. The universities are more and more aware of the discrepancy of honors classes in Michigan public high schools. And so many of them, when they recalculate your grades, they're throwing out honors classes because they know that it's not as rigorous as what they expect an honors class to be. So my philosophy on honors is that it's still needed. It still can enhance almost any class. There may be a need in some cases to have distinctly different classes between levels where you have an honors designated area. But I guess I would propose you can find honors experiences in almost all classes by giving kids the option or choices to expand their knowledge and apply their knowledge if they so choose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Delgado, once again, thank you for spending the whole day with us.
My pleasure.
It's got to be mentally exhausting. I know this is your regular work schedule, but it's still tough to be on back to back to back. We
pleasure.
appreciate it. So as we talked about earlier, you've been through panel discussions in the morning and then this community meet and greet. A thread, I believe, and the community knows the board was not involved in all those earlier sessions, but I think this is a topic that the whole community is interested in. The special education topic came up both in the parent panel and I believe again in the meet and greet. And I think what the community is trying to assess as I hear these questions, right, is who is Dr. Delgado in terms of special education around expectation setting for children, philosophy around inclusion, as a process manager, one who's been responsible, at least in your latest stop, for the special education function. I'm not probing for specifics in Walled Lake or anywhere else, but I think the community is keen to hear you talk as a father and as a manager and as a person, right? How you see this role in public education, and what are your ideas for kids in this topic of inclusion and growth? Anything you can just comment on that, I think will benefit the community who didn't hear the
Sure.
parent panel, didn't maybe hear the meet and greet.
Thank you for the question, and that was a theme in a couple of the sessions. And so in my role right now in Walled Lake, I do oversee the special education department, and most of that is kind of procedurally monitoring to make sure that we're meeting all of our compliance deadlines and that we're trying to move professional development in a fashion that really kind of enhances the experience. We have some specific special education goals in terms of revising specialized instruction in our learning resource centers, increasing our graduation rate. And so that's kind of my role, is to work with our director of special education to really enhance those things. Things like co-teaching and making sure that there's an authentic co-teaching model where both teachers are partnering together. My philosophy when it comes to special education, and I've mentioned before, my wife and I our youngest son has an IEP as well, so we're very familiar with the process. My philosophy is that students should be included as much as possible in all aspects of their schooling. They should be able to access all areas of the curriculum, all areas of the school district's programs. I believe that the IEP process is one that is intentionally crafted around individual conversations. There's a reason that it's called an IEP, an individualized educational plan. And so teams of teachers, when we talk about process, teams of teachers follow those guidelines to really work with parents, work with teachers to gain the feedback and to come up with a decision that they think is most appropriate in terms of a placement or the level of services or the amount of services, the duration of services that are going to meet the child's needs. Philosophically, the whole purpose of special education is to allow students who might have a challenge or a disability to rise to the level of their peers on equal footing, to give them an opportunity to demonstrate that they've learned, demonstrate that they're progressing, and to be part of things on equal footing with everybody else. And I've been very proud of the work, not only in all the districts that I've worked in, but just as a country, how we've evolved on more and more inclusion for our families. And so I know that there were some questions or concerns about kind of procedures or process involved in a specific situation that were involved in Walled Lake, and obviously I can't comment on that. But what I can tell you is that we follow all procedural guidelines. We treat everyone with dignity and respect. We value their voice. And sometimes in school districts, school teams and parents don't agree on what they think the best placement for a child is. And that's why there are procedural guidelines and under the law where people can exercise their opportunity to appeal. But philosophically, I believe that it's really, really critical for us to maintain special education programs in our district, and I think we do a really great job here. Our own son is thriving because of the people in this district and because of their care and their love for him.
Okay. Just a quick follow-up. Just, and maybe this is unfair, but as a parent in the Birmingham Public Schools District, even from today's conversations, and I know you just get snippets, right? It's hit and run all day long. But is your sense that your philosophy for what we hope for our children and procedurally as a manager, do you think you align with where the Birmingham Public Schools are? Or if you're different, where do you think you're different? Different can be better, right? or not, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but what's your sense in terms of how you fit or how you align, based on what you know so far about Birmingham
Sure.
Public Schools?
Thank you for the follow-up question. I believe I align with where the philosophy is in terms of the parent group and parent expectations and how much has been done here in Birmingham. What I heard people say through their words and through what they were able to communicate is that they're at a level of trust that maybe did not quite exist to their liking before. That there's a trust and cooperation with the district, that there's an advocate for them, or there was an advocate in central office for them with a prior superintendent, and they're looking for another advocate. I am an advocate for children with disabilities. I am an advocate for parents with children with disabilities. And so I do believe that I align philosophically with the desires to have that cooperation continue in this district. I don't come in with any preconceived notion. I don't have a very rigid philosophy about kind of procedural aspects. I'm very, very collaborative, and I do believe that I align with them. And what I heard them say is that they're nervous that the next person is going to derail years of progress that they've made to really have a better working relationship with the board. And I can only say the words, you'll have to see it in my actions, but that's not who I am. I'm very collaborative, and I do believe that I align with their expectations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, I enjoyed lunch immensely, by the way. It's
Thank you.
great to
Nice
get to
conversation.
know a lot about your philosophy on children and raising children. I think we're very aligned on a lot of those things.
And travel.
And travel, that's right.
Yeah, well, and my daughter, a fellow New Yorker now, so.
Very impressive.
By the way, I'm sorry to interject something.
That's all right.
Do you know when I saw the picture of Cassie just now, I realized that Cassie was one of the kids who did such a great job on the congressional hearing, she and her group.
On the
And you
project
didn't
in
even,
Berkshire.
yes. That,
Yep.
you know, that was one of the projects I spearheaded.
He never
and-
ceases to impress us.
And I think her passion for this public, or the,
The global public policy.
yeah.
Right.
I mean, could have started in 8th grade, I'm just saying.
Taking
It
all
was
the credit.
your,
Thank you, teacher, right?
that's the spark. Delayed gratification, I'm sure she'll thank you down the line.
Sorry, Walter.
No, that's okay. I'd like to go back to something that you've mentioned a few times, we've asked questions about, which is the strategic plan, and as you pointed out, it's coming to term, and a new plan will need to be developed. In our first discussion, our first round of interviews, you had mentioned in response to a question that I think I asked, that strategic plans can be hard to measure. And in your presentation tonight, you had your diagram with mission and values at the top, and then the strategic plan flowing out of that, which I think is, I was very happy to see that. Mission and values are different than a strategic plan
Yes,
from,
they are.
I think, most perspectives. Could you talk a little bit about, in the context of that a strategic plan is difficult to measure, you did mention in your 100-day plan about measurable goals, and you also mentioned the correlation between instructional priorities and the strategic plan and the goals within it. Could you talk a little bit about not so much the approach to developing the strategic plan, I think you've explained that, but your perspective on what are the components that you would like to see in a strategic plan that are measurable?
Well, thank you for the question. I think when we go back to the strategic plan, when I was referencing that sometimes it can be difficult to measure, many of them are written with kind of language about students reaching their potential. In the third goal, it talks about students will demonstrate empathy and be ethical leaders. And so I think the first thing that I'd like to see is, not that we have to deviate away from more affective goals, but some metrics to what does that look like? And I think I said this last time. If we still want to talk about ethical leaders and focusing on character education as one of the goals in the strategic plan, so what does that look like? Will we train all of our students by a set date? Will we introduce this in 6th grade in a formal setting? You know, will there be X amount of community service projects that we think will help demonstrate that empathy? How are we tracking this? Because I'm sure that many of these things are happening. We may not be measuring them or tracking them, but some of the ones that are more affective, I'd like to see, first of all, the component is kind of a definition of what are the metrics, how would we measure them? The second thing is for the ones that actually can be more easily measured. The very first one talks about a learning environment that's engaging and free of achievement gaps. We can measure achievement gaps, but I'd like to see specific action plans that speak to how you're going to address those gaps. So, for example, we were at Berkshire today, we were walking with Principal Klingscale, and I asked the question if they're using the AARI, which is the Adolescent Accelerated Reading Inventory. That's a specific strategy, and they are. It's essentially the reading recovery for middle school, that if students are coming in reading at a 4th or 5th grade level, the goal is to get them up to grade level before they leave middle school. It's a wonderful program. I've used it in 3 different districts, and so that's an example of the instructional priority matching the strategic plan. So if part of the goal is to eliminate those achievement gaps, which we know are heavily in literacy and numeracy, having the second component you ask, having an actual action plan with the specific programs or strategies that can measure that. So that would be a way I could look to see the instructional priorities to the AARI program and then track that data. And we swapped stories about, in Walled Lake, we had AARI at the middle school and the high school. We had a full-time teacher at both. Within just a few years, with the intense intervention at middle school, we were able to reduce that high school staffing down because we caught them early. So that's just one kind of targeted plan that I would like to see in terms of getting more to metrics of some of the goals in the strategic plan. And depending on how the process works and whether or not people want to maintain, you know, these specific goals in terms of unlimited opportunities, holistic education, you know, those kind of aspects, we'd have to look and see if that's where the community wants to go. And then if so, I believe you can define the metrics that would help you track that.
Thank you.
So as a follow-up, Chris, would you say your team that reports to you, would they say that that's how you manage them is through the strategic plan and hitting those accountable points and talking with them on a constant basis of how are you doing with whatever your metrics are?
So I oversee the 19 principals and then the director of athletics and special education. And so I kind of shared my evaluative process, this annual process. And so it starts with the goal setting, and I don't micromanage that or dictate what their goals are going to be. I ask them to bring their school data, whether it's academic data or discipline data or graduation rate data, and then craft their goals. And then the periodic meetings that I have throughout the year, absolutely. When they come to a meeting, they know that I'm going to be asking them about the data, and so then we have a conversation about the data and what are the action steps you're doing, what are the things you're trying, are they working, are they not working? And I don't want to paint this picture that, you know, people are nervous, they have to get their data spreadsheets ready before they come and meet with me, because they don't. It starts with relationships. But they know that it's about continual growth and improvement and tracking. And if you get to decide your own goals at the beginning of the year based on your school data, and say, for example, your goal is to introduce a character education positivity project, I'm going to ask you how you're going to measure it. And then in February when I come back, we're going to look at the measurements. Well, have you done it? And so I think it's just a way to track progress towards any program. And it's a little more difficult with others that are not quite as concrete. Academic ones, you have a little bit more data at the ready, but the affective ones we can measure as well.
So, sorry, I'm going to take a follow-up question. So, but help me connect the dots and up to the strategic plan to kind of dovetail into Walter's. How do we evaluate? So we've got the strategic plan that's going on, we're purportedly measurable, but then you're letting principals get with their own goals. What, you know?
Thank you. Sure, I can clarify. Okay. So when we have those goal meetings, the first thing actually that we do as a leadership team, actually in August with the session that I presented about innovation, we always remind them of, we don't have a strategic plan, but we have district goals. And so the district goals that we submit a district improvement plan, their school improvement plan has to align to the district goal. Okay. And so we start with that as kind of the foundation. So they get to pick their own goals based on their data, but it has to align directly with that district goal, school improvement goal. And so, you know, and they can deviate to some extent, but it aligns that way.
Gotcha.
So it's
Okay.
basically, it's running it back up to the district improvement plan.
Got it, okay, thank you.
One of the things you shared with us in your 100-day plan was cuts that you've made. I think it was, did you say 70 million?
70 million we've made.
Okay, so I was kind of interested in maybe learning more about that, but perhaps it's better to apply it here. So here, the simplest way to put it is there's a larger deficit than what we've seen in the past. I think
I think it's
that's,
3.5 million or something projected, yeah.
and so I'm wondering how you navigate coming in mid-year and being faced with the potential responsibility of making cuts, or even or even being the person who has to put that on the table. What does that look like? How do you own that responsibility when you're in a financial circumstance that you've essentially adopted because you're coming in at the time you are? And then I was also interested in, given that reality here and in other districts, do you have any innovative ideas for generating revenue?
So a couple things. I'd have to rely heavily on our team of cabinet and understanding the budget process that they've gone through before. I certainly have gone through my own in several cycles of this, where we actually will start with kind of our mission statement, our values, our district goals, and then when you're looking at cuts, unfortunately, you have to look at those that may not align as directly as the others. And this is really, really difficult work to do. But I think when you start the process, everything needs to be on the table. Sometimes you get to places where there are sacred cows that do not get cut ever. And I think that it's healthy to have a conversation about every aspect. And so, how would I do it? I think that whatever budget process you use, whether you use one that's recommended by the state of Michigan business officials, or you use other kind of formal process or a more informal process, you need to look through the lens of your district goals, your strategic plan, those things that align back to that. So in terms of the how, that's how I envisioned it, and I've talked about the budget cycle and gathering feedback from people once you have that aspect. So, and that's what we've done. At the highest, we had a $23 million cut, and at the lowest, I think we had a $4 million cut this past year. So there's no low-hanging fruit at all. And so it really comes down to those hard decisions, and the process of involving people helps you make that decision. In terms of revenue generating, the one thing that we've done, I know we don't do that this year in Birmingham, is we've opened up schools of choice more extensively, and so we've done marketing. I'm not proposing that necessarily, but that has been kind of our largest revenue generator. We, like everybody else, have declining student enrollment because people are aging and they're staying in their homes, and we have a lower birth rate. The other thing we've tried to do is have more partnerships with some of our local businesses, donations. We have partnered with some of the auto firms in the area that have been able to give some contributions. We have really examined, we're actually right now in the middle of a second facility study. We've done a facility study. We did one about 6 years ago, and we're revising that for the possible consideration of a bond if it's palatable to our community. But part of that analysis is looking at, are we right-sized in terms of our schools and capacity? And do we need as much land, for example, as we have? We've sold off parcels of land. We've closed schools, which are very difficult to do. I've been involved in now 3 school closings, so 2 elementary schools in Walled Lake. So 2 elementary schools my first year, and I interviewed for that position. I had to give a mock presentation to the Board of Education on how I would redistrict schools across 55 square miles for 15,000 students, and I got the job, and they said, welcome to Walled Lake, you're in charge of redistricting. So I cut my teeth on that process after closing 2 schools, but it was for the right reasons, to right-size our district and to be fiscally responsible. And a few years later, we just closed a community education building. I think I was telling someone today, It was the original high school in Walled Lake. And that was very painful. That whole process, you need a lot of leadership in that process to honor kind of the sadness of the community and to involve them in the process and give them voice before you make that decision. All of those things take planning, they take compassion, and they take community meetings. And I digress a little bit because, you know, when you're looking at generating revenue, if you have to, you have to look at those hard decisions. You have to sell off land, you might have to close schools, and those are all things that nobody wants to do. Boards don't want to do that, superintendents don't want to do that, but sometimes you have to, and I've been through it. So if we ever had to venture into that in the district, I'd be prepared for that as well.
Do you have a story to share where the timeline's been really condensed in making a budget decision? Because I'm thinking, should you come in January, what if you have to make a decision by February or before June, you know, on where, on making the district more fiscally sound? It doesn't, especially because you'd be coming in at a time when the strategic plan has expired. I guess I'm wondering what it looks like in a little bit more chaotic circumstances.
Well, I guess I don't have a specific story or example, but I guess what I can share with you is that because we never know how long it's going to take for the governor's proposal and the House and Senate proposals to come after the revenue conference that happens in January, we start with kind of a range. And so as we come in January, if I were to come here soon, we'd have to look at, okay, we know it's about $3.5 million deficit. What do we think our range of per pupil funding is going to be? And then you look at that range and you do kind of an ABC scenario. And we've done that before in try to anticipate how deep on the list of cuts that we've had to do. And that's really what we've done, is we've prioritized after our community meetings, after our budget shows, and really had a list of, okay, if we get $100 a student, here's where we're gonna have to be, here's where class sizes need to go to. If we're fortunate, we get a little bit more, we don't have to go as deep, but if not, we have kind of a worst-case scenario. So I think that you just have to, you anticipate that delay, you anticipate the chaos. Sometimes it's as late as May before we know the per pupil, and we all know we need to have a budget by June 30th. And so we kind of anticipate that by setting up separate plans.
And is the ABC plan, is that part of what's relayed to the public in your roadshow format? Do they get to know?
It's developed after that feedback, and then it would be communicated publicly. So it just depends on once we get all the feedback from all the stakeholders, then we would go back as a cabinet. When I say we as a cabinet, we would say, okay, here are the scenarios we need to anticipate based on the range. We would bring that usually to our Board of Education in a session and share, here's where we're thinking of, you know, is there anything on the list that is a non-negotiable for you that you want us to take off, that we're not going to cut? So, you know, we'll do that process with the board, and then we would communicate that back out to the public.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chris, before, to Adrian's first question, can you describe for us your experiences with bonds, sinking funds, and all that, drumming up additional public funding?
Sure. So I've been fortunate in the 8 years in Walled Lake to actually, I've been part of the team that has passed a successful bond, a successful millage renewal, which is a hard one to do because people don't understand necessarily what a millage renewal is, and a sinking fund. So all of those processes have been a wonderful education for me to understand how that process works and how much proactive work you need to do to communicate to the community the why of your ask, right? And the impact, for example, the millage renewal, people didn't really understand how detrimentally impactful it would have been for Walled Lake. I think we would have lost about $30 million if it didn't pass. And so to communicate that to parent groups and to the community at large. And so I've been part of those teams. It all starts with cabinet, and we're actually literally in the middle of those conversations where we've been working for the last probably 4 months with Plant Moran and with AUK Construction, who I think you work with as well. But that whole process of community meetings, presenting that information. For us, for example, right now we did a facility study after the redistricting just to check in on capacity. Are we still right-sized? how old are our buildings? We walked into Greenfield today that I think was built maybe, they said 2004 or 7 or something like that. So we have an elementary school in Walled Lake that was built in 1928. And so our average buildings are probably 60 or 50 years old. And so we started this process of doing kind of a facility analysis, working with Plant Moran and Ock, and had a presentation that we've brought to our leadership team. We held 4 community meetings and really trying to set the groundwork, not necessarily to ask for a bond, but to just to take the community's temperature. Yeah. We've had over the years such deferred maintenance that things like our roofs are just leaking, our pavement and all of that, just like your own house, if you defer that maintenance, it catches up with you. Right. And so we have presented that. So the whole process, all 3 of those, whether it's the bond, the sinking fund, millage renewal, any of those, and if we go for this second bond, it really takes a lot of communication, a lot of marketing. I've done a lot of work with our community director of marketing and community relations to get the word out in any and every pocket that you can to really make sure that you get the voice of the people before you take things to a ballot. And back to Ms. Young's question about scrunch timelines, we're under an incredible timeline right now because if we're going to propose going for a May bond, we have to get to Treasury by January. And so, and it's December. And so, you know, so we just had a board meeting last week where Plant Moran came and they presented the results of our community forum. And then we're soliciting more feedback with an email chain. And if we have one more board meeting in December that we would have to ask for their approval to go to Treasury. So that's a crunch deadline. I don't know if we're gonna pull it off. I don't know if the community is gonna be in support. In the community meetings they were, but I've been part of all of those processes. And it just, what it underscores for me is the importance of over-communicating. You can't communicate enough when it comes to these really critical asks of your community. And that's why we've been successful, I think.
Great, thank you.
I have a question about that with communication. So what responsibility, if any, do you think you owe the community when the bond's wrapping up? What do you have to share with them? And what if you're in a situation where the bond's wrapping up and there are certain things that you originally sold to the community that didn't get done, that in a year or 2, you're probably going to ask for money to maybe accomplish those then? You know, what happens when it turns out your communication plan, you're going to use 50% of it again when you ask for more money 10 years from now? You know, and you're left with a frustrated community. Can you talk to me how to navigate the end of a bond communication and then what happens with incomplete projects?
Sure. Well, it should be a celebration that you've accomplished what you said you were going to accomplish, that you appreciate the taxpayers supporting you and that you've implemented that. If not, frankly, you have to own it and you have to be transparent. I heard that loud and clearly in the conversations that I've had in the last months preparing for this possible position, is that the community is looking for that transparency. There are some times where you might need to explain how things have changed in the construction field, for example. Our director of facilities can very eloquently explain, you know, much better than I, you know, the increased costs of materials, and that precluded us from doing X, Y, or Z on this roof, or we had to go to a different type of, you know, asphalt. I'm making that up. So, but you can explain that sometimes if there's a legitimate reason that you couldn't accomplish that. And I'll give you a little parallel. So about 5 years ago, the community in Walled Lake passed a $68 million safety, security, and technology bond. We, like you, like many other schools, we increased the Sally ports at our offices and buzz-ins. So security improvements are enhanced for surveillance cameras. As part of this potential next bond, if we so ask for it, and if the community supports it, we have put on there an idea, just to take the temperature of the community, about security enhancements. Because unfortunately, the horrific tragedies continue, and there are, in the industry, there are enhancements now. That's going to be very difficult to go back to people to say, well, wait a minute, I just approved $68 million for safety. Why do you need more safety? And so it's that communication and that explanation of enhancing something. And so I think with all of it, it's communication, it's being transparent, it's owning it, it's explaining why things may not have happened. And, you know, and if we made mistakes, it's being honest about that too.
Can you give me a specific, sorry, but can you give me a specific example of communication? What is it, like, what does it look like? Do you invite parents to a special meeting? Do you send out a newsletter that's dedicated strictly to budget? Is it just a little blurb in Walled Lake e-news? What does this look like?
So obviously, it can come in a variety of forms. One of the things that we've tried to do to explain, especially when we're leading up to the sinking fund and the bond, that we've tried to explain more complex aspects, was we would do video casts that we would keep on our website. So we have some wonderful ones from our Assistant Superintendent of Business that really understands the history of school funding in Michigan, going back to Proposal A, and the actual per pupil funding and the 2011 cut that we all experienced here in Michigan, the per pupil cut. And so, you know, I think part of the communication, you have to find a way to get to all pockets of your community. And sometimes it could be a school messenger, voice message, home to parents. We've done that sometimes, and not just for snow days, you know, but to hear a voice message. I used to do that as a principal, and sometimes to hear just a positive voice message from your kid's principal, you know, let alone the superintendent, you know, to communicate something fun to you, or something that we're proud of. But school messenger messages, obviously, e-blasts, if you know, if there's a Friday e-blast, most principals will do something along those. But I like the video podcasts, especially in a big area. The other thing that I have committed that I might try is tweeting. Now, I have never been on social media ever. I've never even had a MySpace page. I've never Facebooked. I don't tweet. I haven't done any of those things. But I have had colleagues tell me that I can be very eloquent and profound in 120 characters or less. So I don't know if that's an insult or if that's a compliment, but I have seen the power of Facebook and Twitter promoting district programs. And I see it, my mentor, Ken Gutman, who's the superintendent in Walled Lake, tweets all the time about positive aspects that are happening in the community, and really gets a lot of return kind of on that investment, if you will, or, you know, pays dividends in reaching a large community with so many families. And so I might be committed, I might be inclined to start tweeting. I don't know how long until I'll do Facebook, but that might be an opportunity to communicate. Because again, people are going to get their communication, their news feed wherever, you know, wherever it's convenient for them. But there are a lot of different ways you can stay in touch with the community.
I highly recommend scheduling a large block of time with your kids about the proper use of hashtags and really navigating social media.
I'm gonna have to.
Yeah, that's going to
learn
have
that.
to be a line item in your schedule for sure.
I'll put
So.
it in my 101st day.
Yes, yes.
You should.
If Trustee Young will yield the
Oh,
floor
yeah.
for a moment. A quick follow-up on Adrian's question, Chris. And by the way, I think Twitter, I'm not a social media person either, but I think Twitter has increased
I think so.
substantially the number of characters, so.
Oh, is
you
it?
can- Yeah, I believe so. Is that true?
100
I
Is it
wouldn't
past
know.
100?
True. I'm not giving him the seminar. I recommended his kids.
In follow-up to Adrian's question about a bond, and this will probably go into the category of leading the interviewee to the answer, but I think it's important to talk about a little bit Adrian's thinly veiled description of getting to the end of a bond and having to explain the execution and what was and was not delivered. Could you talk a little bit, you mentioned partnership, preparation, and learning, and you talked a little bit about the preparation and how you like to prepare for, certainly it was a big part of your 100-day plan is the preparation piece. Could you talk a little bit about how you might avoid getting to the end of a bond and having to explain to the community what went right, what went wrong, what we got right, what we didn't get right? everybody, I think, certainly this community is a very insightful, understanding, intelligent community. Things change in construction, stuff happens, there are contingencies for that. But can you talk a little bit about the preparation aspect of potentially looking at a bond proposal to the community? How do you avoid being in that position down the road where you have to explain unpleasant outcomes?
Yep. Thank you for the question. And essentially, I would look at status updates. It's one of the things that we did with this bond, the bond that has just completed in Walled Lake, but we only did this to the Board of Education. And so we would have our facilities director give a status update about 2 times a year. But in hindsight, we probably should have communicated that to the community and community forums. And so I think that if you have a 4-year bond, rather than having it be end of year 1, is, couple times a year, status updates, you do a community session, you communicate that out. Here's what we asked for, here's what you granted us in terms of tax dollars. And we did have the 4-year phase for us, is these schools would get done this year, these schools the second year, and give that status update. But I think that is real critical, so there are no surprises, that people have an expectation. If things change and you have to delay or you have to prioritize something, that you have a roof cave in and so another building has to be, bumped up to phase 2, then it's part of that status update that you already have scheduled. And so when you do the long-term planning of how long the duration of the bond, it's kind of communicating that. I think the other thing too is financially being able to communicate how the bond is being used. And you see some of the signs outside, this is how your bond dollars are being used, but getting right to, this is how much we've spent, this is what we've accomplished, and here's the next order of business. But those status updates are something that we could probably do a better job of.
I probably didn't ask it as explicitly as I should have. I was thinking more in terms of pre-bond. That's important, what you were just talking about, the communication aspect, once the bond is in place. I'm talking about preparation before the vote by the community on the bond. In other words, the preparation, packaging, selling, marketing of the bond and what it entails. Could you talk a little bit about how you would view that process so that what is being proposed, and given the unknowns and the contingencies that will inevitably be there, but trying to get as close as possible to what actually will be delivered for the dollars that are proposed in preparation before the vote?
So I spoke a little bit to it in terms of the preparation of starting kind of with a facilities assessment that we did. And so, and again, right now, literally, that's what we're doing is that preparatory work. We haven't asked the community for anything, but starting with kind of that analysis, we've done a comprehensive analysis of every classroom in the district, every building, every boiler, every HVAC system. So I think all of that preparatory work, getting that done first and then bringing that to the community and asking them, if we wanted to do the entire district, we would need probably over $800 million, and that's not realistic. Is what are you comfortable with? What are some things that you would prioritize? And so, working through that process before you ever go for the ask. We're fully prepared right now to not go for a bond if the community doesn't support it. But we want to educate them by doing all of that preparatory work. And some of that you literally pound the pavement, you go and you see the facility, some you contract out. But I think all of those aspects are important to communicate. It's also important to communicate the timeline for when you would be asking, when the vote would be, when construction would start. Sometimes people think they passed a bond and they think that construction is going to start the very next day at their child's school, as opposed to, over the summer, in the fall. So I think that the more that you meet as a group before and you have the preparatory steps, and you have a communication plan long before you even get into specifics, that really helps. What we're doing right now is starting kind of on a broad scale of all the needs in the district and then seeing where the priorities are. And we've pointed out a few different aspects. One of the things in a bond is looking at your different community groups. Are there athletic improvements that we need? Are there improvements to the arts or music or theater programs? What are the curriculum designs? I saw some wonderful examples of flexible seating and some curriculum design, some alternative instructional models at the schools. And so we have part of our presentation on curriculum enhancements. Now, if our community prioritizes kind of the reconstruction of a building that was built in 1940 over instructional classroom, then we need to hear from them. And so we do anonymous polls, we try to do all that prep work and communicate that to the community long before we ask for the bond. So hopefully that answered a little bit better your question.
Any more on the bond? Can I move to a different topic?
Yeah, please.
I'd like to talk a little bit about early learning. I know you had a chance to go to Greenfield Elementary today, and it was kindergarten room, is that right?
We saw the preschoolers on their way, I think, back in the building, and they all greeted us with huge, highs like this. And then we went to kindergarten, first grade, fourth grade. So we did hit the
Perfect.
school.
So let's talk about early learning. Our preschool population, as you know, we have a population that qualifies for preschool. We have another population much larger that can afford preschool. In fact, it's quite competitive in the area. Parents do analyses between private, parochial, and public options. What's your philosophy around the role of preschools and public education as it relates to early literacy, the character education programs that we talked about, framework that we talked about last time? What are your thoughts? What should Birmingham be doing? Is there more that can be done there?
So in general, I think that pre-K is so critical that it should be universal for all students, that it should be universal not only pre-K, but kindergarten programs at all schools. The Early Childhood Center, I know that you have a wonderful program there that follows the high scope curriculum. It's a solid curriculum that we use as well, and it not only works with their academic needs, but it gets into some of the social emotional learning that we've talked about before, and the character education development. And so you see the discrepancy so vividly in communities where parents have access, some parents have access to preschool and some parents don't. You know, we saw a little young lady today at the meet and greet who was showing me her book. And I asked her about the book, and she went on and on for about 5 minutes about the book and was showing me, she was reading the book to me, and she was in kindergarten. She was only a couple months into kindergarten and reading this book. Not everybody can read in kindergarten in 2 months. Not everybody comes to school prepared. We know the research on early literacy, and we know what happens when you can't read at grade level. That's where the third grade threshold comes from. And so, you know, you see it get more and more challenging. The nonfiction text gets so hard for kids that it's imperative that we look at early literacy intervention. You know, if I had my druthers, pre-K would be free for everyone, and get families involved as early as possible, get them connected to the schools. We also talked about preschools being in the schools, if permissible, if you have the space, so you build that community connection, so you can have mentors, or you have older kids that are working. We saw an example of that with the kindergartner, where the fourth graders were reading with the kindergartners. The other thing that is just a beautiful thing to see, we have at some of our preschools, we have the ECSE, the Early Childhood Special Education Program, in with our preschools and kindergartners, and the kids are all interacting together, and they're part of a school community, and those folks stay in that school community. And so I'm a huge advocate. I think the research is absolutely clear that schools all across our country should be focusing more and more on early learning, early childhood, early literacy for all the right reasons. And the social-emotional aspects come along with it, but it has to be explicit. And a lot of the more progressive curriculums intentionally include that character education development at a young age. We were in a kindergarten class today, I think it was kindergarten, and she was talking to her students about the concept of food insecurity. The kids couldn't even say insecurity, but they knew what food insecurity was. And that was amazing to see that in action. The empathy, and this goes back to the strategic plan, the empathy that these children around the holiday season were talking about through a kindergarten lesson. And so I'm an absolute advocate of it, and we see it in action. It's just a beautiful thing to see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think another question. From a values or belief perspective, you know, being in this leadership position, obviously being transparent is so important to all stakeholders involved, and it's a difficult task making decisions that are not going to be popular.
Sure.
So can you tell me, what are some of your limits, like your non-negotiables?
So one of the first things is anyone who is unkind to a child. For me, that's a non-negotiable. If it came to kind of a labor relations issue or having to address, you know, a personnel decision of somebody who was unkind to a child or abusive to a child, that's a non-negotiable for me. I think that you go into this profession because you care deeply about children, about their futures, and you should be forever committed to those futures. I think the other aspect that would really be a non-negotiable is not treating all parents with dignity. One of the toughest aspects of my job that I do right now is I oversee all of the expulsion hearings in Walled Lake. And I personally run the due process hearings with families, with their attorneys. And I'm proud of the way that I handle expulsion hearings, the most difficult decision you can have to make with a family there. But to treat them with dignity, whether they come in, you know, very savvy in understanding the laws, or with an attorney or without an attorney, I treat them all the same and inform them of their rights. And so if I saw situations where people within this organization were not being ethical, were not treating parents with dignity, were taking advantage of maybe a parent who might not be as educated as another parent, for me, that's unethical, and that's an issue of integrity. And so that would be a non-negotiable for me. And in these positions, you have to say no, but you can do it professionally, you can do it respectfully. I've been told, just be yourself, you know, be honest about your opinions, about your perspective, explain the rationale for a decision, and if people don't agree, at least they understand where I'm coming from. And so that's what I take into my job every day in terms of being a man of integrity, working with families and advocating for kids.
Okay, thank you.
I want to ask one that I saw, and this is unfair, maybe this came up, I think, at maybe at one of the parent panels. We get a written synopsis. I'm reading the wonderings, the questions, right? Yeah. This is their takeaway, and they're anonymous. I don't know who this person is, but it talks about your deep connections to Birmingham Public Schools, right? Through your family, through your wife, and through your children, which is a great thing. In fact, there was some kidding going on at the meet and greet that we got the wrong Delgado up here for superintendent. Maybe we should have had Leslie up here instead of Chris, which is a great compliment to your wife and her terrific career. Yeah. But the question was, can he do this job, all kidding aside, can he do this job in Birmingham with those connections? And it's not my concern, but I see it here in writing, and I want to put it on the table so you have a chance to address that with the entire community.
Yeah, thank you.
Chris, before you answer it, it's funny that I didn't see that one yet, Steve, but I had a verbal inquiry along those same lines. And you have mentioned a few times relationship with community, staff, the union, the board, and how important that is. And I think your answers have been right on as far as the approach. And the question I got was pertaining to staff and your spouse being a staff person. We have a retired member of the union on the board. Could you, in answering Steve's question, talk a little bit about how you would position yourself relative to contract negotiations and that sort of thing?
Sure. So the very first night, I handed you a list of about 25 names of people here in Birmingham who know me either professionally and or personally, who have advocated for me for this position because they know of my work ethic and they know of who I am as a person. Tonight, I shared with you a list of about 40 people from Walled Lake who have worked with me and can and can communicate what I'm like to work for and work with. The fact that I know a lot of people in this district doesn't mean that I won't be able to hold people accountable, that I am in any way swayed one way or another. The individuals that are on that list, many of the principals that I know, I've developed wonderful personal relationships with them and professional relationships over the 8 years, but we don't go out together, we don't socialize together. There is a line that needs to be professionally drawn. And that's the same way for the individuals here in Birmingham that I know as they are in Walled Lake. So I'm not concerned in the least. I think it's a fair question. You know, is he going to be too soft on teachers because his wife is a teacher? Is he going to be, too easy on administrator evaluations because he knows a lot of administrators? I think if you call any of those principals in Walled Lake and ask what my evaluative process is, they'll tell you that it's a pretty intense, rigorous process, even though I personally respect them as individuals. But I have always adhered to a strict professional line. When I was a teacher, with my principal, when I was a principal with teachers, there are lines. You don't socialize, you don't go out together, you don't communicate on those levels. And I have always adhered to that strict line of professionalism. And again, if you focus on goals and data and progress, then the conversation is one that you can talk about performance and not worry about personal connections or personal feelings. So I have no concerns. I think it's a fair question, but I have no concerns about any prior relationships because they've been professional relationships as well.
Thank you.
Okay, just looking at the time, trustees, let's give it another about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll start to wrap up.
Doctor, this was a question too from one of our stakeholders, and I think it's a good question, and it has to do with being a deputy superintendent. How do you see that role different than becoming a superintendent of a school? You know, the kind of the difference. If you could talk a little bit about, kind of how that works a little bit.
Sure.
In your opinion.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things, first of all, I mentioned in the 100-day plan the wonderful mentors that I have. I've been able to work with some of the best superintendents around the county, around the state, and learned a lot from them. It is true that you never really know a job until you're in the job. There's no question about that. But I think one of the advantages that I bring to this is as deputy superintendent of schools in Walled Lake, essentially, I run the day-to-day operations of this enormous district. So our superintendent works directly with our board, he works with the community connections, he does a lot of legislative advocacy, but he gives me essentially the full reign and responsibility to run the day-to-day operations. So I'm not a deputy of a specific area, I'm not an assistant of instruction or just a certain area, but I have to oversee the entire issue, the entire school district. So any and every issue that happens in our school district, from a safety threat to a curriculum concern, to a transportation need, those come to me. And then the systems that I have and the people that I work with have really kind of prepared me to take that step into the superintendency. The other thing is, I've mentioned before, I've been able to work with our superintendent and attend legislative sessions, attend the superintendent's conferences. And so for the last 15 years, I've worked hand in hand with superintendents at their meetings, at their legislative meetings. I see the process of influence that a superintendent can make. And so, case in point, I was invited to Lansing last week. I was the only deputy superintendent there in our group. And this was a tri-county group of Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne County superintendents, all superintendents and me. And this has been my story since I joined the Minority Student Achievement Network when I was a founding member of OSAN. So I was an assistant principal from Andover High School, young kid with a room full of superintendents. And so I'm prepared for this. I think that the breadth of my responsibilities in Walled Lake is an advantage, but I'll admit, you never know a job until you get into the job, and I've got some pretty good mentors that I can rely on to help me take that step forward.
So
Thank you.
to piggyback that question, so right now, you're working with your group of principals that report to you. So let's talk then, now you become superintendent, you're working with central office, you've got a world of different experiences and skill sets. How do you work with the team, our team of central office, to ensure it's a highly functioning team, given, again, the different skill sets and experiences that they all bring?
And that is the critical work. There are two really important things, and that's why I put them in the first 10 days. It doesn't mean they'll get accomplished in the first 10 days, but the conversation will begin in the first 10 days. The most important thing for a superintendent is to cultivate his or her relationship with the board and then with his or her cabinet. And so I have seen districts where cabinets have been divided, where there are special interests from one group and there's not that unified voice coming out of cabinet. Conversely, I work right now for a very healthy cabinet where we're not territorial, we're very collaborative, we're very supportive of each other's initiatives, and we're very honest in a healthy way if we have concerns or criticism. What I've learned from our superintendent is that in the superintendency, you have to let people do their jobs. You have to try to cultivate those relationships, and you have to meet with them individually and then obviously collectively every week. But you can't micromanage people. You need to treat them like professionals and kind of develop that team. And they've been here, they have much more knowledge than I do, the historical knowledge, and so I need to do a lot of listening. I can't come in with my preconceived notions about them or their positions or any of the programs in this district. I know enough to know that you don't know everything until you get in a system, and then you may not even know all of it. And so, but if you listen more, and talk less and develop that team and cultivate those relationships, then you can have a really powerful central office with a wonderful relationship with the board, and together we can do great things.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Trustees, anything?
Just one more?
Yeah, sure.
So how do you cultivate relationships? How do you go about doing that?
So one of the things, had this position started over the summer, I would replicate the model that we've used for several years in Walled Lake, and one of the things I've learned from our mentor is looking at, first of all, kind of doing a cabinet retreat. And you may do a cabinet retreat already. But we spend a couple of days in the summer kind of doing a couple things, reflecting on the prior school year, vision questing for the next school year, looking at goals, looking at data, but a lot of that time together is team building. And you can't underestimate the importance of team building for people to come together. It's a balance, and I do this at my principals meeting too. It's a balance of kind of heavy lifting instructional conversation and then getting to know each other, relationship building, and finding the right personalities that kind of blend. All of these positions are about a fit. And so I've done my best to let you know who I am, to see if that, in your mind, if I'm a fit with you. And so, and I've really enjoyed getting to know about you. But you cultivate those relationships by continued conversations, meeting frequently with your cabinet individually, obviously meeting weekly with them together, and then building that teamwork. What we do is we'll meet in the summer with a cabinet retreat and kind of set that tone and do some team building, and then we follow that up with our leadership team retreat with all 50, 60 principals. And it's a lot of the same of team building and planning and goal setting, and you have to continue that throughout the school year. And so one of the examples that I use, I open all of my principals meetings with a little segment that I call memoirs. And so I say, if you've never worked in schools, if you hear the stories of things that happen in schools, you can't make it up. But when we all retire, you could fill volumes and volumes of books if you wrote your memoirs. And so I may have an agenda, I have a counselor's meeting Friday. I may have an agenda that has 16 heavy-duty topics, really hard to talk about, some difficult decisions, but we start with memoirs. And I found over the years, people love memoirs. because we laugh. Sometimes it's inspirational, sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's uplifting, sometimes it's just venting. But we start with memoirs, and people tell these funny stories about working with kids, and then we go on to the heavy lifting of the conversation instructionally. So you really cultivate teamwork and organizations by being present with people and interacting with them frequently and taking time to make sure that we have a little fun too, and that we laugh and we enjoy our job.
Thank you.
Okay. Trustees? Any other questions? Steve? No?
Good.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I'll turn it over to you if you have any closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I do have a closing statement. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you again tonight. It's nice to be back with you. I thoroughly enjoyed my day today. It was a long day, but it was a great day. A lot of wonderful conversations, meeting so many people, especially the students that we were able to meet. Birmingham is a wonderful community, and at the core of great communities are great schools. We need good people leading schools who are committed to every child, who believe in teachers and support them, and who partner with parents. I'm not looking for a job. I'm looking to join and lead a school community and use my experience to positively influence the lives of thousands of children. At the core of who I am is a belief in the power of education to change the trajectory of a student's life. I'm living proof that in as little as one generation, education can be the key to change a person's life from poverty to opportunity. And I believe that being somebody who has valued education, and what my wife and I have done with our children to help them value education, in one generation it's now just become the norm. Our kids do their homework, they value the education, and it's changed their lives. Yet, like students everywhere, our three children are very different, even though they've come up in an environment with a couple of teachers. One loves music and is attending a state college. One we've talked about is attending a private university and aspiring to head to law school. And one is looking at more of a vocational route, possibly. But I see in my own children what I've seen in all the children that I've worked for in my 24-year career in education. I just see an individual. And I think that's critically important. All kids take different paths, and they need us to help them find their way by supporting their ambitions and encouraging them. And even though I do consider myself a quasi-internal candidate, I know I have a lot to learn as your next superintendent. And to that end, you know that I've researched the district. I would love the opportunity to learn more. You saw how meticulous I was in my planning of my 100-day plan and how involved I want to be in the lives of students here. And I'll bring that work ethic and commitment every day. And I'm excited about not only continuing the excellence that exists here, but finding additional ways to enhance the experience for all students. I'd be honored to work for such a thoughtful board and to serve the school community as your next superintendent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, Chris, thank you for spending the day with us, and thank you, Leslie. Thank you. Trustees, any other comments, information? Nope. Okay, and so for the community, we will be meeting here again tomorrow at the EAC, 7 p.m., and that meeting will be live streamed. Anything else? Oh, as well as we have a meet and greet tomorrow beginning at 5 p.m. Yes. Any other things? No? Okay, with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.